Tonight, we step into rural Korea of the late 1980s, a land of harvest and hushed radios, where the rain falls heavier than memory and the night swallows sound whole. In Hwaseong's quiet fields, a young woman never made a home. By morning, her body lay among the reeds, her scarf twisted into something obscene, as if the countryside itself had turned against her. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Within weeks, another woman vanished, then another, until the soil of Hwaseong became a ledger of names erased too soon. Neighbors whispered that the rain carried omens, that red clothing had become a death sentence, that someone, somewhere, was choosing his victims with patience bordering on ritual. The police combed the field with flashlights, interrogated thousands, promised safety they couldn't deliver, and still, the women kept falling. 10 in total. Each life extinguished in silence. Each scene left behind like a signature in mud and blood. They called him a phantom. The countryside called him a curse. And for 30 years, his name stayed hidden, even as his shadow hung over Hwaseong like a storm that refused to break. It starts in rain. Always rain. September 15, 1986. A stretch of farmland in Hwaseong, the kind of place where nothing should happen beyond the rhythm of harvest, cicadas, and gossip carried on the wind. But that night, a woman's body was found in a ditch, her face half turned toward the dark sky, as if asking for an answer the clouds refused to give. The detail that burned itself into memory wasn't just the cruelty of the act, but the object beside her, a single piece of her clothing tied into a grotesque knot, as if mocking the order of the world. Investigators stood there, boots sinking into mud, realizing they weren't looking at a random misfortune. They were staring at the first page of a nightmare anthology. And then it happened again, and again. 10 women, from teenage girls to grandmothers, silenced over the course of 6 years. Their lives taken not in the shadows of some sprawling metropolis, but in quiet rice fields and rural roads, the very spaces meant to cradle routine. The case would come to be known simply as the Hwaseong murders, but that plain label hides the scale of the horror. This wasn't just a string of deaths. It was a slow burn corrosion of trust, a haunting reminder that evil can take root in the ordinary, that a country still rebuilding itself from poverty and dictatorship could be paralyzed by something as ancient as cruelty. And here's the cruelest irony. For decades, no one knew who he was. Whole lives passed, new governments rose, technology shifted, and people whispered theories like ghost stories. And then, finally, after 30 years, a name emerged. Chun-jae, a man who had lived among them the entire time, drinking, laughing, pretending, while the blood of strangers lingered somewhere in his memory. You're not supposed to find monsters in the rice paddies, but Korea did. And what's worse, they didn't even realize until it was too late. South Korea in the mid-1980s was a nation in flux. On the surface, it shimmered with the promise of transformation. Neon signs flickered over crowded markets. Factory shifts powered through sleepless nights, and families dared to dream of middle-class life after years of poverty. Yet beneath the hum of progress, the country was still raw, scarred by military rule, censorship, and the aftertaste of authoritarianism. Trust in the state was fragile, and law enforcement operated with brute force rather than precision. Hwaseong, where this darkness would bloom, wasn't so still in concrete sprawl. It was farmland and factories, a quiet countryside where neighbors still bowed in the street and whispered across fences. The land was dotted with narrow irrigation canals and roads that seemed to vanish into fog. In the evenings, mist rolled off the rice fields and hung low, making familiar strangely menacing. Women walked those roads alone, carrying groceries or heading home from work. They wrapped scarves against the chill, their silhouettes soft against the street lamps. They didn't know that someone else was watching, always watching. The danger unfolded against a backdrop of cultural silence. In Korea at the time, There was an unspoken etiquette. Crimes of the scale weren't something openly discussed. Families grieved quietly, ashamed, as if tragedy was an unwanted stain. The press reported details cautiously, stripped of sensation, partly out of deference, partly out of fear of provoking panic. This atmosphere gave the killer exactly what he wanted: space, time, anonymity. Even the police, armed with hundreds of men and endless manhunts, struggled to adapt. This was before DNA databases, before CCTV, before the kind of forensic tools we take for granted now. Instead, they marched through fields with flashlights, combed ditches, and scribbled notes on clipboards. A killer who knew the land, who moved with the rhythm of the countryside, could dissolve into night like vapor. And so, in the silence of those rural nights, dread took root. Mothers warned daughters not to travel alone. Husbands walked their wives home. Radios whispered updates, but never clarity. Each new body felt like a clock ticking down to something worse, and no one knew when or where it would strike again. Hwaseong was no longer a quiet county. It had become a hunting ground, and the people trapped within it learned a terrible truth. Sometimes a monster isn't at the edge of the forest, but standing just out of sight, blending perfectly into the crowd. When investigators finally put a face to the shadow, decades later, the name that surfaced was Chun-jae, a man so utterly ordinary that his ordinariness became terrifying. Born in 1963, he grew up in a modest home in Chungju, south of Hwaseong. His childhood wasn't splattered with obvious signs of impending cruelty. No infamous diagnosis, no trail of juvenile crime. He was just another boy who walked to school in the dust, another son raised in the rigid Confucian mold of time. Teachers remembered him as quiet. Neighbors described him as polite. The script of normality was flawless. And that's exactly what made the truth unbearable. By the time the killings began, Lee was in his 20s, married, employed. He worked in factories, drove trucks, blended into the humdrum flow of South Korea's growing workforce. His neighbors waved to him. They drank with him. He even offered advice to friends about parenting, about work. Imagine sitting across from him, never realizing you were sharing a table with the man who had turned Hwaseong into a graveyard. But beneath that mask, there was something else. A compulsion that clawed at him, a hunger that couldn't be seen in family photos or small talk. Victims spanned generations. Teenagers on their way home from school, housewives, even women in their 70s. There was no single type, no clear pattern, just opportunity. Lee's crimes weren't about passion or revenge. They were about control. He stalked, waited, and struck with methodical precision, leaving investigators with scraps of confusion rather than clues. What's chilling is how comfortably he lived between two worlds. Predator by night, everyman by day. That duality meant he never needed to run or hide. The police interrogated over 20,000 men, collected fingerprints, interviewed locals, and Lee was never seriously considered. He was right there, invisible not because he tried to disappear, but because he looked so much like everyone else. When the truth was finally unmasked decades later, those who knew him struggled with disbelief. How could this man, the one who borrowed sugar, who fixed cars, who cracked jokes at barbecues, be the phantom who strangled 10 women and haunted an entire nation? That's the unnerving truth about monsters like Lee Chun-jae. They don't wear horns or scars. They smile, they nod, they pass you on the street. And all the while, they carry secrets that could rot the soul of an entire community. It began with a body in the ditch, but that wasn't what truly cracked the air in Hwaseong. The first real disturbance came later, when people realized it wasn't just one, that the violence wasn't an accident of circumstance, but part of a rhythm, a pattern so calculated it felt like fate was tightening its grip around the county. The second victim, a woman in her 20s, was found not far from her home. Her scarf, once a simple accessory, was twisted into the tool that ended her life. The detail was too precise, too intimate. The police knew at that moment. Someone was hunting deliberately. By the time the third victim surfaced, the silence of the countryside had turned into static. Families began locking doors that never used to need locks. The rice fields, once places of livelihood and laughter, became ominous backdrops for whispered warnings. Farmers walked faster. Children were hurried indoors before dusk. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. But here's where it takes a darker turn. The killer wasn't content with just striking fear. He manipulated his surroundings with grotesque creativity. At one scene, investigators discovered a faint trace of a radio request. A popular ballad had been played on air, allegedly dedicated by the killer himself, while another body was cooling in the night. Whether true or folklore, the rumor spread like wildfire, fueling the idea that he wasn't just killing, he was mocking. Police swarmed the region with manpower never before seen in South Korea. Hundreds of officers patrolled the fields. Checkpoints sprouted on dirt roads, and investigators carried sketch pads instead of certainty. Yet, somehow, the killer always stayed a step ahead. He vanished into folds of rural life like a shadow that obeyed no rules of physics. And the pattern of victims gnawed at the edges of reason. A teenager heading home, a middle-aged wife, a grandmother. The only thread connecting them was vulnerability. The solitude of walking at night in a place where no one should have to be afraid. He stripped away not only their lives, but the illusion that the countryside was safe. This was a disturbance, not just a series of killings, but the shattering of the ordinary. Hwaseong was never going to be the same. What began as a single nightmarish anomaly became a storm of dread that rolled across 6 years, growing louder each time another body appeared. And everyone, police, villagers, the nation itself, knew they were staring into something far bigger than one man's cruelty. They were staring into a void. The thing about a mystery like this is how it doesn't just sit still, it metastasizes. The Hwaseong killings weren't confined to the grim borders of crime scenes. They bled into conversations, into rituals, into the way people walked home at night. Fear became communal currency, traded in every whispered rumor and side-eye glance. And the police? They chased shadows. Thousands of suspects were dragged into interrogation rooms, their hands inked for fingerprints, their words recorded with trembling precision. Over 40,000 men were investigated, and yet every lead dissolved into nothing. The killer was a ghost in broad daylight. Patterns emerged, but like broken constellations. Each victim had been walking alone at night, often with an umbrella, a handbag, or a piece of red clothing. The killer seemed to favor rainy evenings, when the sound of downpour masked footsteps, when shadows stretched and blurred. Villagers began to believe that even the weather was on his side. Red clothes became talismans of doom. Umbrellas no longer symbolized shelter, but risk. And then came the letters. Some claimed they were from the killer himself. Taunting notes that described crimes with sickening accuracy. But whether they were authentic or cruel imitations, no one could be sure. Every word was dissected, studied like scripture, and still, the police remained blind. Theories spiraled like wildfire. Was it a soldier, trained to kill with precision? A farmer who knew every irrigation canal and field? A stranger drifting from town to town? Some whisper about multiple killers, a cult, even a copycat ring. The sheer absurdity of the failures invited imagination to do the work evidence couldn't. And behind every theory was a deeper ache, the sense that the institutions built to protect people were faltering. The police raided homes, interrogated the innocent, even tortured confessions out of suspects who later proved unrelated. The public, instead of comforted, grew more alienated. Fear wasn't just of the killer anymore. It was of the yawning incompetence surrounding him. The mystery wasn't just who is he? It was How can one man outwit an entire nation for years? That question cut deeper than any knife. Because if a faceless predator could make fools out of thousands of officers, what protection did anyone really have? By the time the 10th body was found, the people of Hwaseong weren't just grieving the dead. They were grieving their certainty in the world itself. A countryside that once promised safety had become a chessboard where everyone was a pawn and the killer, unseen, untouched, was always 3 moves ahead. Imagine the chaos of an investigation, so sprawling, it consumed an entire generation of police work. Over 2 million man-hours were poured into the Hwaseong case. That's not hyperbole, it's literal. Squads of officers combed the rice paddies with flashlights, forensics teams lifted thousands of fingerprints, and roadblocks were set up so often they became part of the landscape. It was the largest investigation South Korea had ever attempted. And yet, nothing. Every time the authorities thought they were closing in, the trail turned to mist. A cigarette but found near one body. Fibers on another. Handwritten notes sent to the police, signed with a mocking flourish. But nothing held. The science of the time was too primitive, the databases too empty, the tools too blunt. They were fighting a phantom with sticks and chalk outlines. Theories began to eat the case alive. Some detectives insisted the killer was a local farmer who knew every bend in the irrigation canals, slipping away like a fox into its den. Others swore it had to be a soldier stationed nearby, someone trained, disciplined, moving with tactical precision. The military connection had a certain appeal. After all, who else could execute 10 killings and evaporate each time under a net of thousands of officers? There were darker theories, too. That was more than one person. That the murders were ritualistic. That the killer was deliberately planting false leads to drive the police mad. The public began filling in the blanks with folklore. At one point, locals whispered that the manhunt had flushed the killer into another region, and any crime miles away was instantly pinned on the Hwaseong phantom. He had become less a man and more a legend, and the police, desperate, humiliated, started bending the rules of reality. They rounded up suspects at random, grilled them for days, demanded confessions. One man, Unsolved, a factory worker with limited vision and intellectual disabilities, was coerced into admitting to one of the killings. Convicted. Sentenced to life. He languished in prison while the real killer walked free. The case had devoured an innocent man and called it progress. If you were an officer back then, you'd start to wonder if the ground itself was conspiring against you. 10 women gone, each case tied together by threads too thin to grasp. A scarf here, a rainy night there, and somewhere out in the fields or at the corner store, maybe standing in line for noodles, was a man who had orchestrated all of it, smiling, unbothered, watching the police dig trenches in the dark. Theories multiplied, answers didn't. And with each failure, the killer's myth grew stronger. Every investigation has its breaking point, the moment when the search for truth curdles into farce. For Hwaseong, that collapse came with the wrongful conviction of Unsolved. Picture it. A 22-year-old factory worker, partially blind, intellectually vulnerable, dragged into an interrogation room where sleep was a rumor and pain was constant. After days of relentless pressure, he confessed, not because he was guilty, but because he was human, because sometimes the easiest way to stop suffering is to tell your tormentors what they want to hear. And the police? They clung to that confession like drowning men clutching driftwood. Finally, they could announce progress. Finally, they had a face to parade before the cameras. Never mind that the evidence was paper thin. Never mind that the killings continued afterward. They locked Yoon away for life, washing their hands of a case that had already made them a national embarrassment. The public, though, wasn't convinced. Whispers spread. How could a half-blind man overpower a young, healthy woman in the middle of the countryside? How could he leave behind forensic clues so inconsistent, so unaligned with the others? The conviction smelled wrong, like rotting wood beneath a painted surface. But the machine of justice had turned, and Yoon became the sacrifice to keep it running. Meanwhile, the killings did not stop. Women kept disappearing into the night, their bodies surfacing days later in the fields. Each new victim was a reminder that the true predator was still out there, laughing at the spectacle of an innocent man rotting in a cell. The breakdown wasn't just procedural, it was spiritual. Citizens stopped believing in the system altogether. If the state could torture confessions out of the weak, what chance did ordinary people have? If the police could be tricked by a killer who toyed with them for years, what was the point of patrols, of investigations, of justice itself? And the killer, whether he meant to or not, became something more than human. He was a myth, a rumor, a bogeyman whispered to children. Don't stay out late, or the Hwaseong phantom will get you. The police had lost not just the battle, but the story. They were no longer the hunters. They were the punchline. That was a turning point. Not a dramatic arrest, not a breakthrough clue, just a slow, grinding collapse of faith. By the early 90s, the case files were stacked high, the leads dried up, and the man in the shadows remained untouched, still walking the same roads as his neighbors, still blending in, still carrying the unspeakable truth. For years, it looked like the Hwaseong murders would rot in the archives forever. The statute of limitations in South Korea, 15 years for even the gravest crimes, expired in 2006. Think about that. 10 women dead, a nation terrorized, and the law itself quietly declared, time's up. No more prosecutions, no more trials. The Phantom could walk free, his record washed clean by the clock. Families of the victims weren't just mourning. They were abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. And then, in 2019, something cracked open. Advances in DNA testing, the kind that wasn't available back in the 80s, breathed new life into old evidence. Samples preserved for decades were reanalyzed, and suddenly, like a ghost stepping into the light, a match appeared. The DNA pointed to a man already behind bars for another crime, a man named Chun-jae. He had been in prison since 1994 for the brutal death of his sister-in-law. All those years, the Phantom of Hwaseong wasn't some international fugitive, wasn't hiding in shadows across oceans. He was sitting in a South Korean prison, aging quietly, blending in with the other convicts. When confronted with the evidence, Lee did something no one expected. He confessed. Not reluctantly, not in fragments, but in full detail. 10 murders, the assaults, the failed attempts, even crimes the police hadn't linked to him before. His words spilled like poisoned water, filling in the blanks that had haunted the country for 30 years. He described stalking women along the roads, waiting in the rain, striking with cold calculation. It was less a confession than a purge. And yet, the resolution was bittersweet, almost mocking. Because of the statute of limitations, Lee could never be tried or punished for the Hwaseong killings. The law shielded him, even as he admitted every detail. He sat there, behind bars already for another crime, recounting horrors with an almost casual tone. Families heard him. Survivors heard him, and there was no gavel waiting to fall. The questions, of course, linger. Why confess after so long? Was it guilt, boredom, arrogance? Did he crave the stage, even if it came decades too late? And what about the years between the killings and his eventual imprisonment? Were there more victims, more stories lost to silence? Resolution came, yes, but it was jagged, incomplete. Justice had been delayed so long that when truth finally arrived, it was toothless. And South Korea was left to wrestle with a question as suffocating as the crimes themselves. What good is the truth if it can't deliver justice? The Hwaseong murders didn't just scar a county. They reshaped an entire nation's psyche. For decades, The case was shorthand for failure, a symbol of how fragile law enforcement could be in the face of a calculating predator. It shook the people's faith in the police to the core. Neighbors began to second-guess neighbors. Strangers became permanent threats, and the countryside, once a landscape of trust and routine, became an arena of suspicion. When Chun-jae finally confessed in 2019, the aftermath wasn't catharsis. It was rage. Rage at a justice system that had locked away an innocent man for 20 years while the real killer lived freely. Rage at laws that allowed time to wash away accountability. Rage at the sheer banality of the monster who admitted everything with the blankness of a man recalling errands. Yoon Sung-yeol, the wrongfully convicted, was exonerated only in 2020, 30 years after being dragged into prison for a crime he did not commit. Think about the scale of that theft. 3 decades of a man's life consumed by concrete walls, while the real predator smiled across the street from his neighbors. His release was bittersweet. Freedom, yes, but also the kind of wound no apology could stitch shut. The case forced reforms. South Korea abolished the statute of limitations for the most serious crimes, acknowledging the grotesque absurdity of letting time erase accountability. Forensics advanced. Cold cases were reopened, and the public demanded a justice system built not on confessions extracted through pain, but on science. Culturally, the murders became part of Korea's dark folklore. Films like Memories of Murder dramatized the despair and incompetence, embedding the case into cinematic legend. Generations who hadn't even been alive during the killings grew up knowing the Hwaseong fandom as a specter, a reminder that evil doesn't fade with time, it waits. And then there's a quieter legacy, the one carved into the families of victims. For them, closure never really came. They had endured funerals without answers, decades without justice, and finally, a confession that brought truth without punishment. Their grief became permanent architecture, a structure they live inside every day. The legacy of Hwaseong is not just about 10 lives stolen. It's about the realization that systems fail, that monsters can thrive in plain sight, and that truth alone doesn't heal. The case left South Korea with scars that shaped its laws, its art, and its collective memory. And those scars still burn, decades later, whenever the rain falls hard over empty fields. Here's the part that sticks in the throat. Chun-jae never looked like the stories we tell about killers. He wasn't a shadowy drifter, wasn't a stranger lurking at the edge of photographs. He was a neighbor, a husband, a man who carried groceries, lit cigarettes, cracked jokes, and yet inside him was a void so cavernous it swallowed 10 women, and perhaps more we'll never know. The police hunted a phantom, but the phantom was never hiding. He was mowing his lawn. He was waving hello. He was a person you'd never suspect, because he seemed too unremarkable to be anything else. That's the horror buried inside the Hwaseong murders. Not that a monster existed, but that he existed so normally, and the tragedy compounds. Justice arrived too late, muted by the statute of limitations. Truth came stripped of consequence. The killer got to sit in his cell and narrate his crimes like a grotesque bedtime story, while families listened with the weight of decades on their backs. Closure? No, just a cruel reminder that time doesn't heal, it calcifies. If there's a lesson here, it isn't a comforting one. It's not about resilience or the triumph of science or the inevitability of justice. It's about fragility, the fragility of systems we trust, the fragility of communities we think are safe, the fragility of knowing the person standing beside you is just who they say they are. Somewhere in the rain-soaked rice fields of Hwaseong, the echoes of those nights still linger. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the confession, not the reforms, not even a legacy in film and law, but the silence of the land itself, an open wound where ordinary life once flowed. Because sometimes the most haunting thing isn't what evil does. It's how easily it hides in plain sight, waiting for the day we finally dare to look straight at it. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.